The sound of hooves cut through the dry morning silence like an old clock ticking away the last seconds of lost time. Dust rose behind the lone horse as it descended the winding hillside trail. A slow wind carried the scent of warm earth and aged wood to the small village of Dust Creek, where time seemed to have stopped, or forgotten to move forward. Sitting on a worn saddle, his boots covered in desert sand and his eyes hidden beneath the brim of an old hat, Samuel Ward finally returned home. 6 years. 6 winters and 6 summers had passed since the day he left, with an uncertain destination and a promise on his lips. Back then, there was still hope in his chest and a name engraved in his mind: Eleanor. But now, the man who returned was no longer the same man who had left. There was something on his shoulders, heavier than the dust of the road and colder than the shadows of the clouds. A weariness that came not from the journey, but from the years that had robbed him of everything that mattered. No one saw his arrival. No bells rang. No children ran to meet him. Only the old raven perched on the church roof let out a hoarse caw, as if recognizing the return of a ghost. Sam swung down from the saddle with a creak of leather and bone. The horse snorted softly, and he ran his hand over its neck with the tenderness of someone who knows solitude. Ahead of him, the town seemed smaller than he remembered. Quieter, more contained. The saloon still had its dusty windows and swinging doors that creaked at the slightest touch of wind. The smithy remained in the same spot, its embers slumbering and the smell of burnt metal in the air. But something was different, not in the buildings, in the people. He took his first steps down the main street. Eyes followed him from the half-open windows. Voices whispered behind the doors. An old man sweeping the sidewalk outside the barber shop stopped when he saw him, rubbed his eyes, and slowly walked back inside. No one greeted him. No one recognized him, or pretended not to. It was as if time had made him a stranger. Sam stopped in front of the city's main hall and pulled a yellowed piece of paper from his coat pocket. The fold was frayed, and the ink faded. It was a letter. It said little, but it said everything. 5 lines written in haste and desperation, as if the author knew every second would cost him dearly. He read it again, as he had since finding it 2 months ago in a dingy cell on the outskirts of Santa Fe. Don't come back. For everything we've lived. For everything we still dream, please don't come back. If you do, it will be too late. Eleanor. The letter had no date, no explanation. Just the raw pain of someone who had given up on waiting. He folded it and put it in his inner breast pocket. Then he moved on. He crossed the street in silence, feeling the heavy eyes on his back. He passed the store, the water fountain where he used to fill the canteens, and finally stopped in front of a house with a wide porch, with dried vines climbing the wooden columns. The paint was peeling, and the flowers in the garden were gone. But he would recognize the place even with his eyes closed. This was where Eleanor lived. This was where she waited for him, or at least, where she used to wait. He took a step forward, and then the door opened. For an instant, time stood still. In the doorway, wearing a pale linen dress and her hair tied in a simple bun, stood Eleanor, more mature, perhaps a little paler, but with the same eyes he'd remembered as if they were his last refuge. But there was something else in them now, something hard, painful, a silence that screamed. Her eyes met his. No words were spoken. Only the sound of the wind through the dry branches and the soft creak of the wood beneath their feet. And then, as if the world had decided to resume movement, a shadow appeared behind her. A tall, straight-backed man with a well-groomed beard and a silver necklace around his neck. He wrapped his arms around Eleanor's shoulders in an intimate gesture and looked at Sam with something between surprise and contempt. Thomas Ward, the younger brother, the man who always lived in Sam's shadow, who always wanted to be like him, or better than him. Sam took a step back. Eleanor looked away. Thomas broke the silence. "I thought you were dead." The sentence cut like a dull knife. Eleanor remained silent. Sam didn't answer. He just turned slowly, walking back down the road he'd come from. His steps were heavy, his breathing ragged. On the porch, Eleanor put a hand to her chest, as if holding something that threatened to shatter inside her. Sam stopped only once, at the side of the road. He looked at the city, now distant behind the wind-tossed dust. It wasn't home anymore, and maybe it never had been, but he hadn't come looking for shelter. He'd come looking for the truth, and that truth still awaited him. The sky was darker that night Sam left, as if even the stars hesitated to say goodbye. Dust Creek's main street slept under the weight of a strange, almost reverent calm. The store doors were locked, and the saloon, for the first time in months, had closed before midnight. Only the creak of the old seesaw on Eleanor's porch could be heard. She sat there, a shawl draped over her shoulders, clutching a white handkerchief he had given her last winter. Sam walked slowly, his spurs jingling with each step, like a clock ticking down the final seconds before something they both knew they could not avoid. He stopped before her, took off his hat, and looked down for a moment. When he looked up, he found her eyes watery, but steady. There was something about her that always disarmed him, a mixture of sweetness and strength, like a breeze bringing rain before a storm. "It's just for a few months, Ellie," he said with the husky voice of someone who'd rehearsed that line 1,000 times. "I need to get this sorted before we can really get started. A piece of land up north, clean, away from my father's debts, with water, shade, everything we need to start from scratch." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She just stood up, walked over to him, and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "Do you promise to come back before autumn?" Sam held her face tenderly in his hands. Those eyes were the only thing he carried with him. That promise, the only weight he would bear. "Before the leaves fall, I'll be back, with the land contract and your name on the certificate. We'll have it all, Ellie. I swear." The kiss was lingering, but restrained, more like a farewell than a passion. And then he mounted his horse and rode off, without looking back. He knew that if he did, he wouldn't have the strength to go. And he had to go. Not out of ambition, but out of a sense of responsibility that life had thrust upon him too early. To do something no one else in his family had the courage to do. To build something honest from scratch. The journey to the Pecos Mountains was long, but not enough to prepare him for what was to come. Sam had been instructed by an old acquaintance from the war, a man named Grady Miller, who claimed to know of a pristine tract of land registered to a deceased former rancher with no heirs. It was a rare opportunity, and Grady had promised the proper documents, for a high but fair price. Sam worked for 2 months on ranches, sleeping in barns and taking any job that paid him in coin or food. He was determined. He was close. But the world, especially the world of the Old West, doesn't usually reward decisive men easily. In the 3rd week of June, Grady disappeared. The tavern where he usually drank was closed, and no one remembered him anymore. Sam learned from a clerk who had crossed into Arizona that Grady had been arrested in Santa Fe on charges of cattle rustling and forgery. Sam headed there immediately. He had only the man's promise and 2 signed receipts, which in practice were worth less than dust. But he went. It was all he had. Arriving in Santa Fe, he went straight to the local sheriff. He requested a hearing, presented the papers, and tried to explain his connection to Grady. But one look at the documents was enough to make the sheriff's eyes harden. In less than an hour, Sam was forced into a cramped cell, charged with attempted fraud and possession of false documents. He tried to explain himself, tried to fight, but his words fell on deaf ears. The trial was swift, almost symbolic. 3 years in prison. Blood River, a prison built in the heart of the desert, where the sun punished even the shadows, and the days blended into the nights due to the heat and abandonment. There, time left its mark deeper than any physical scar. The letters he wrote to Eleanor, more than 20, were never answered. Her name was a whisper he repeated every night before falling asleep, like a prayer or a cry for help. But silence was all he received. When he left 3 years later, there was no more news of her. The town seemed like a distant memory, the kind of memory that hurts too much to be entrusted with hope. For a while, he wandered the Texas countryside, aimless. He tried to forget. He tried to convince himself that maybe she had moved on, or that she had died. It was easier to accept death than betrayal. But then, in a dingy frontier saloon, he overheard two men talking about Dust Creek. One of them mentioned Eleanor, now called Sraw Ward, and Sam froze. The name Ward wasn't hers, it was his. And then, like a bolt of lightning splitting a dry tree in half, came the question he'd never wanted to ask. Did she get married? To whom? The silence of the prison, the ignored letters, everything began to make sense. But there was no certainty, only questions that burned like a fever. It was only 2 months before his return that he found the letter. In an abandoned cell south of Santa Fe, where he had spent a night sheltering from the storm, he found an old locked iron cabinet. He broke the lock, and there, among empty bottles and moldy blankets, lay a cardboard box of forgotten papers. Among them, a single letter with his name on the front, written in Eleanor's handwriting. There was no date, just 5 lines, and in them, the end of everything that had once been a promise. Don't come back. For everything we've lived, for everything we still dream, please don't come back. If you do, it will be too late. Eleanor. The letter had never been sent, and the envelope's seal bore the Dust Creek crest, which meant someone there had intercepted it. Someone had decided Sam shouldn't read those words, and that someone could only have come from within the town. Perhaps from inside the very house where he planned to live the rest of his life. Maybe someone with the same last name as him. Perhaps Thomas. The sky over Dust Creek was a pale gray the morning after Sam arrived. The sun, always so merciless in that dry land, seemed to hesitate, as if it knew something had moved beneath the desert dust. The town was different. Not just in the details that the years impose, a new fence here, a repaired roof there, but in something more subtle, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. It was as if the soul of Dust Creek had withdrawn, hardened, changed course. Sam walked slowly down the main street, feeling the slight creak of leather under his feet, his eyes taking in everything with the attention of someone who no longer knew what he could trust. The facades were carefully painted. The windows now had curtains. Even the wooden posts seemed straighter. It was a city trying to appear better than it was, and perhaps to others it was. But to him, nothing there felt right. It was like visiting the grave of someone still breathing. The once noisy and unkempt saloon now boasted new polished doors and a sign hanging from iron chains that read, "The Silver Spur Inside." Soft music drifted from a tuned piano, accompanied by restrained laughter and careful conversation. It wasn't the same place where Sam and his friends celebrated victories and forgot defeats. It was something else. Something cleaner, more polished, more controlled. From the bar, the saloon's new owner, a man with a thin mustache and a velvet vest, watched Sam enter, as if spotting a shadow the sun couldn't dispel. He didn't say a word. He just gave a slight nod. Sam nodded in kind and walked to a table in the corner. He sat with his back to the wall, as he had in the past, and ordered a whiskey with a discreet gesture. As he waited, his eyes scanned the faces there. Few he recognized. Some were new residents, others perhaps just passing through. But then, in the far corner of the room, he saw a familiar face, Mary Langford, who had been a teacher at the small local school, now with grayer hair, but the same attentive, steady gaze. When her eyes met Sam's, she froze for a moment. Not with shock, but with uncertainty. There was something about him that resembled the man who had left, but time and suffering had erased the familiar contours. Still, she stood, crossed the room, and stood before him with a grim expression. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said, her voice quieter than he remembered. Sam looked up slowly. There was a strange warmth in his chest, a kind of nostalgia that hurt more than it comforted. "I thought so too." Mary looked around suspiciously, then leaned in slightly to speak to him alone. "It's not safe for you here." "Why?" he asked, without changing his tone. She hesitated. Then she simply replied, "Because you came back too late." Before he could say anything, she walked away and left the saloon, as if every second there cost more than she was willing to pay. Sam fell silent. The glass was placed in front of him, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he thought about Mary's words, and about everything he still didn't know. Outside, the streets were slowly filling up. Carts passed, children ran with paper kites, and a group of men, wearing dark coats and grave expressions, stood in front of the church. Among them, one stood out, Thomas. He wore a crisp white shirt, a dark gray vest, and an elegant hat that bespoke status. He had the bearing of someone who commanded, or at least believed he did. Sam watched him from behind the saloon window, his fists clenched under the table. This was new. Thomas had never been the leadership type. When Sam had left, he was just a hard-working farmer, always a step behind, always in the shadows. And now he was in the center of the city. In the center of the conversation. In the center of everything. That same afternoon, Sam decided to walk to the old wooden church at the top of the hill. Not because he was seeking faith, but because from there, he could see the entire town. It was where he went when he needed to think, when he still believed he would one day build a solid life there. He climbed the steps slowly, the cold wind blowing against his face. The boards creaked underfoot, but the place was intact. No renovations, no touching, just time doing its silent work. From the top of the hill, he saw Eleanor. She was in the market square, carefully selecting apples, dressed in pale blue linen that swayed gently in the wind. Beside her, a young brown-haired girl, maybe 8, carried a basket of what looked like bread. The girl turned away for a moment, and Sam felt the breath leave her lungs, the eyes, that deep, steady, gentle gaze. It was like looking into an antique mirror. The girl was his reflection at 7. It was impossible to deny. It was real. The daughter. The daughter he never knew existed. The impact was so strong that he had to hold on to the church railing to keep from falling. He stood there for long minutes, breathing slowly, trying to process what he saw. Eleanor, married to Thomas, and with a daughter who carried his blood. How long had she hidden this? Why had she never said anything? Why the silence? The questions piled up like thunder before a storm. But Sam knew he couldn't go to her now. Not like this. Not with this turmoil inside him. He needed to understand more. He needed to know who had made the decisions, and why. He walked down the hill with heavy steps, as if carrying not only his past, but also the future that had been ripped away from him without warning. He knew, in that moment, that his return wasn't just an attempt to reconnect with Eleanor. It was more than that. It was about everything they had hidden from him. It was about justice, and maybe, about revenge. Night fell over Dust Creek like a thick, stifling blanket. The moon hadn't yet risen, and the stars seemed trapped behind an overcast sky. Sam walked alone behind Main Street, away from the eyes that now seemed to be watching him from every corner. From the moment he'd seen the girl beside Eleanor, something inside him had changed. It wasn't just pain. It was a cold, methodical kind of fury. The kind of feeling that builds silently, unhurriedly, like a coiled snake waiting for the right moment to strike. He needed answers, and he knew where to start looking for them. The town no longer had the same rhythm it once had. The men spoke quietly. The women exchanged glances as he passed. Even the dogs seemed hesitant to approach him. Sam knew what this meant. Thomas had shaped this place in his image, created a convenient version of events, told often enough to feel true. That was how liars survived, by killing the real story and burying it beneath comfortable versions. But he still knew one or two names who had not bowed to Thomas Ward. One of them was Micah Boone, the former sheriff's deputy. A man with a drawl, a sharp memory, and uncertain loyalty, but who owed Sam a debt he couldn't repay with silence. Finding him wasn't difficult. Micah still lived in the back of the old road depot, among empty barrels and broken tools. When Sam knocked on the rotting wooden door, there was a dull thud, like someone dropping a bottle. Micah appeared in the doorway, red-eyed and unkempt, holding a flickering lantern. "Ward," he said, half surprised, half regretful. "I thought you were dead. And I thought you had enough backbone to tell the truth when it mattered," Sam replied bluntly. Micah took a step back. For a second, it looked like I was going to close the door. But something in Sam's gaze, that tense silence of someone with nothing left to lose, convinced him to make room. Inside, the smell of alcohol and rust filled the air. Sam didn't sit. He remained standing, motionless, as if occupying a space not for comfort, but for demand. "Tell me what happened," Sam said. "Everything, since the day I left." Micah hesitated. He took a sip straight from the bottle. Then he sat down and began speaking, his voice low, as if each word were too heavy to carry alone. "Soon after you left, Thomas started showing up at Eleanor's house more often. He helped her mother with repairs, brought her groceries. Gossip began to wag, but no one listened. You had promised to return. Everyone was waiting." Sam didn't answer. He just listened. "Months passed. No word from you. Then, Eleanor received a letter. No one saw the contents, but after that, she changed. She became reclusive. She stopped attending church. She avoided questions. Her mother fell ill and died shortly after. Thomas became more present." Micah paused, as if afraid of what would come next. 3 months later, she was pregnant, and a month before the baby was born, she married Thomas. The silence was crushing. Sam felt his blood pounding in his ears, but he kept it together. "Did you see the letter?" "No. But I heard Eleanor telling old Martha, the one who sewed down the street, that the letter had been sent by someone close to you, telling her to give up, telling her you wouldn't be coming back." Sam stood still. Every sentence was a knife. Every revelation, a confirmation of what he already feared. "And then?" he asked, his voice low, almost hoarse. Micah stood slowly, as if carrying an old burden. He walked to a wooden box under the table and removed a sheaf of aged papers. Among them was a sheet bearing the Santa Fe County seal. An arrest warrant. Name: Samuel Ward. Crime: fraud and forgery. "This was mailed here a month after your arrest," Micah said. "But the sheriff at the time, Bowen, never nailed it to the wall. He said it was an outside matter and Dust Creek shouldn't get involved. But Thomas, he saw it. I remember. He went into the sheriff's office at night and stayed there for hours. The next day, Eleanor received another letter. A new envelope, but with handwriting very similar to yours. It was after that she closed herself off for good." Sam held the paper in his hands like someone holding the ashes of his own name. This was more than betrayal. It was methodical destruction. Thomas had woven a web of lies so well that even his closest victim had believed it. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Sam asked, not taking his eyes off the paper. Micah lowered his head. "Because back then, I thought you were guilty." Thomas convinced everyone. He said you ran away with money, that you tried to con dangerous people. Even I believed it. It wasn't until I heard the full story that I realized. But it was too late. And, to be honest, Thomas runs this town now. No one has the courage to stand up to him. Sam folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his pocket. His eyes no longer held anger. They held something deeper. Determination. Clarity. The truth was almost in plain sight. And each piece fit perfectly into the puzzle of a trap set by blood and greed. He destroyed me to take what was mine, Sam said, more to himself than to Micah. Eleanor. The child. The town. And now he wants me to disappear again. Silently. Micah didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Sam turned and left without saying goodbye. The night was colder now. The moon had finally broken through the clouds, illuminating the deserted street. But nothing in this city was bright enough. Not yet. He knew he still needed to hear Eleanor's voice, to see for himself whether what he sensed in her was fear, regret, or simply compliance. But one thing was certain. She hadn't betrayed him. She'd been deceived, used, like him, like everyone else. And Thomas still didn't know what it was like to face someone who had nothing left to lose. The previous night wasn't over for Sam. The city slept, but he didn't. The truth stirred inside him like embers beneath ashes. Hot, silent, devastating. When the sun finally broke the horizon, dyeing the sky a dirty gold and diluted blood, he knew what he had to do. There would be no more waiting. There would be no more doubts. Thomas had stolen everything, and he had done it with surgical precision, without weapons, without apparent violence. Just with well-chosen words, well-crafted forgeries, and well-timed lies. But none of these were stronger than the truth when it returns with the sure-footed boots of someone who has survived hell. Sam marched down the main street like a man who had already decided his end. His face was shadowed, his eyes steady. There was no longer room for nostalgia or hesitation. He crossed the town with everyone's attention on him. Windows opened. Murmurs began. The ghost now walked in the daylight. Thomas stood on the porch of the main house, a newspaper in his hand, his daughter beside him, playing with a rag doll. Eleanor stood, staring blankly at the garden, as if she could see nothing but her own guilt. When she saw Sam approaching, she froze. The newspaper fell from Thomas's hands, and the girl, distracted, continued humming an old song Sam recognized. A song Eleanor used to sing on cold nights, when all they had was hope and promise. "I need to talk to you," Sam said, looking at his brother. Thomas looked at Eleanor, then at his daughter, and then nodded. He motioned the girl inside. Eleanor didn't move. "Alone," Sam added, without taking his eyes off him. Thomas hesitated. Then he walked to the barn at the back of the property. Sam followed. Eleanor remained where she was, her gaze fixed on their backs. She couldn't stop them, couldn't intervene, but she could feel the world crumbling with each step that took them away from her. Inside the barn, light filtered in uneven shafts through cracks in the wood. The smell of old hay and gun oil mingled with the thick silence. Thomas leaned against one of the beams, crossing his arms, as if still trying to appear in control. "I knew you'd come back, but I thought it would take longer," he said with a wry smile. Sam didn't answer immediately. He took the copy of the arrest warrant and the intercepted letter from his pocket. He threw both on the floor between them. "How much did you pay for this?" he asked. His voice was calm, low, but each word carried the weight of 6 lost years. Thomas didn't move. His eyes fixed on the papers, then on his brother. "I did what needed to be done. You were going to drag her into poverty, to a life of dry land and empty promises. I gave her a home, stability, a family." Sam stepped forward. "No. You took what was mine. You used my name, My absence, my blood. You manipulated her. You pretended to be something you never were. Thomas stepped away from the beam and walked in slow circles, as if carefully choosing his next words. Do you think she would have come back? For real? Even after prison? Even after losing everything? Would she have waited for a broken man, an ex-con, with a criminal record and dead pride? I would have come back. Yes. The answer came firmly. And if she decided not to accept me, it would be her choice, not yours. Thomas laughed dryly, a humorless, soulless sound. You were always the idealist. You always thought love was enough. But love doesn't fill your stomach, Sam. And Eleanor, she didn't need a hero anymore. She needed someone to stay. You stayed because I couldn't go back. Because you made a point of preventing that. Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he spoke with surprising coldness. Yes, I was the one who sent the fake letter. I was the one who bought the sheriff's silence. I was the one who convinced the town you were a lost cause. And I would do it all again. Because, in the end, you left. And I stayed. And that was all it took to build what you didn't have the courage to finish. The silence that followed was absolute. Sam stared at his brother as if seeing him for the first time. The mask had fallen. There were no more excuses, no more pretenses. Only the truth, raw, dark, and irreversible. You don't love her, Sam said finally. You never have. Thomas didn't answer. But the look in his eyes was enough. Sam knew. He'd always known. Eleanor had been nothing more than a symbol of victory, the trophy for a lifetime in her older brother's shadow. Sam turned and walked out of the barn without looking back. His steps were heavy, but his heart was lighter. The anger was still there, but it was clean now, free of doubt. He knew what Thomas was. He knew what Eleanor needed to know. And he knew that the town, sooner or later, would know too. On the porch, Eleanor was still there. When Sam approached, she looked up at him, and for the first time in years, she spoke without hesitation. Is it true? All of this? Sam stopped before her. He looked into the eyes that had once been home, shelter, and future. Yes, he destroyed my chances of returning. He stole my letters. He invented his own. He used my silence. And now he wants to erase me forever. But I'm here, not to fight for myself, but for what's ours. Eleanor clapped her hand over her mouth. Her world was beginning to crumble inside. Everything she had believed, everything she had accepted as fate, was now revealed to be another man's construction. The girl, I know, Sam interrupted softly. I saw it in her eyes. Eleanor turned toward the door, as if seeking refuge. But there was nowhere to hide the truth. Sam touched her arm lightly. Not like before, not as a lover, not as a man in love, but as someone who carries half the story and needs the other half to awaken. I don't want to take you back, he said. I want you to choose, but for the first time, knowing the whole truth. And then he walked away. He left her there, surrounded by the garden Thomas had planted to hide the roots of what he had stolen. The town watched in silence. But silence never lasts forever. The silence lasted 2 days. Eleanor didn't leave the house, nor did she let her daughter go to school. The entire town felt the invisible weight that hung over the house on the hilltop, a tension as thick as the air before a storm. Everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one dared speak out loud. In Dust Creek, secrets didn't die, they just moved. Sam spent this time in a small room at the back of the old Morales family stable. The Morales children, now adults, remembered Sam with respect and gave him shelter without question. He slept little. He spent his nights watching the city from the dusty window, thinking about all that had been taken from him. But there was no more pain, only purpose. On the morning of the 3rd day, Eleanor finally appeared. She wore a dark dress, no adornments, no makeup. Just her, as she was before the war, before the lies, before the town belonged to another man. She walked to the stable with measured but firm steps. Sam saw her coming and left before she had to knock. For a moment, the two just stared at each other. Between them was an invisible bridge made of questions and answers that couldn't be put into words. "I read every letter you sent," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "They were in Thomas's desk, locked away, along with the letter I never sent you." Sam nodded slightly. It no longer surprised him. The pain of omission had been swallowed by the greater weight of truth. "What now?" he asked. Eleanor took a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her eyes fixed on his. "Now, I need to undo what I let happen. Out of cowardice. Out of fear. Because it was easier to believe you abandoned me than to admit I was deceived. I accepted too much. For too long." Sam didn't console her. He knew she didn't need forgiveness, but space to rebuild. There was strength in that look. The same strength she'd had years ago, when she'd faced her mother's death, poverty, the city's stares. Eleanor had always had courage. She'd just forgotten where she'd kept it. "The city needs to know," she said. Sam shook his head slowly. "They won't believe me. Not yet." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "But they will believe me." That same day, at noon, Eleanor entered the town hall during a council meeting. Thomas was at the head of the table, surrounded by merchants, landowners, and shepherds. When he saw her, he tried to stand, but she firmly raised her hand, demanding silence. "I need to say something. Out loud. In front of all of you." The city stopped. Within minutes, dozens of people gathered outside. Windows were thrown open. Doors were thrown wide open. And then, Eleanor told, the whole story, in every detail. From the intercepted letter to the fabricated arrest. From the silence she bought to the lies she'd sustained for years. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just spoke. And the city listened. Thomas didn't interrupt her. He didn't try to deny it. He sat motionless, as if waiting for the right moment to react. But when she finished, what was heard was absolute silence. The kind of silence that carries within it the sentence of an entire people. And then someone stood up. Mary Langford. Then the blacksmith. Then the Morales brothers. One by one, the town's old faces rose up not just against Thomas, but against the lie they had accepted as truth. It was as if, at last, the people of Dust Creek were willing to clear their own name. And with it, the history they had buried along with Sam. Thomas stood up, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Are you going to judge me now? After everything I've done for this city? After years of supporting you, keeping order, taking care of your debts?" But no one answered. That's when Sam walked in. He didn't say anything. He just stared at his brother. The mood in the room changed. There was no more room for words. The next morning, Thomas was gone. His horse, documents, and some money were missing from the house. He'd left in the early hours of the morning without warning. The sheriff tried to organize a search, but the town remained silent. It was as if everyone knew he would never return, and that perhaps that would be enough. But disappearance didn't mean everything was resolved. Eleanor knew this. Sam knew it too. The following weeks were quiet, but fraught. Eleanor moved in with her daughter in a smaller house, far from the city center. The girl, named Clara, spent her days between school and the fields, watching her father from afar, trying to understand who this man was, who had appeared out of nowhere, but who seemed to know her expressions even before she made them. Sam didn't force anything. He didn't ask for anything. He just hung around. He mended the fence, helped in the stable, calmly answered the girl's curious questions. He was a man trying to exist without destroying what was left. But even in the calm, conflict still lurked. Because Eleanor's heart still bore scars, and Sam's too many holes. They talked sometimes, but words still didn't know how to touch the right feelings. Intimacy had been stolen, shaped by absence and heartache. And what remained now was something new, something that would need to be built from scratch. One night, Clara woke from a nightmare. Sam was there. He slowly entered the room, lit the lamp, and sat beside the bed. The girl looked at him with wide eyes, still frightened. "What is it?" he asked. "I dreamed that you were leaving." Sam held her hand, small and warm, carefully. "I'm not going." She watched him for a moment. Then she whispered, "Are you my father?" The question hung in the air like an arrow with no destination. Sam held her in his arms, resting his chin in her hair. "I am, if you want." She didn't answer. She just closed her eyes, leaning against his chest. And there, in the silence, Sam knew the past had left its mark, but the present was still being written, and the future was near. Summer in Dust Creek arrived with cruel slowness. The heat didn't come suddenly. It crept in, day after day, until the air grew thick, and every breath felt like an effort. It was the kind of heat that made bodies move slower and thoughts grow heavier. And it was in that heat that Sam made his final decision. He had spent weeks rebuilding his routine, reconnecting with Clara with cautious steps, respecting Eleanor's time and space. The town had changed too, kinder with its glances, more open in its silences. Old Sam Ward, once remembered as the cursed outsider, was now treated with the reverence of someone who had risen from the ashes carrying truths no one else had the courage to face. But for Sam, there was still one step left. He knew Eleanor was trying to forgive, trying to forget, trying to rediscover that place inside her that had once belonged to him. But time had left its scars too deep, and even as Clara grew closer, there was something between them that wasn't yet whole. So, on that sultry morning, Sam found her on the porch of the small house, sitting with her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Can I sit down?" he asked. She nodded lightly, her eyes never leaving the orange sky that was beginning to boil over the rooftops. Sam sat beside her and waited. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just inevitable. "I'm thinking of leaving," he said finally. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, as if she had been expecting those words, but still wasn't ready to hear them. "Why?" "Because maybe what I came here to find is no longer there. Or maybe it never was." He paused. "I don't want to be a shadow in your lives. I don't want Clara to grow up with two ghosts around her. She needs light, certainty, and I am anything but that." Eleanor turned slowly, her face calm, but her eyes shining. "Do you think running away again will erase everything?" "No, but it can prevent more pain. It can give you both room to breathe without carrying my past on your shoulders." She took a deep breath. Then she spoke firmly. "You're not pain, Sam. You're an open wound. But a wound that's left untended will fester. And I don't want to see you rot away from me. Nor do I want to see Clara growing up without knowing where she came from." He was silent. She approached slowly and touched his hand. "But I also can't promise that I'll love you like I used to. That's dead. What we can have now is new. And it needs to be built slowly, one day at a time." Sam stared at her. There was something more valuable there than passion. Truth. Respect. Will. "I accept that," he said. She smiled, lightly, for the first time in a long time. That same day, he went to the family's old ranch and began clearing the rubble. The structure still stood, despite its abandonment. With the help of the Morales family and a few other residents, he put up a new roof. He repaired the fences. He planted roots, this time in solid ground. Clara began visiting him every afternoon. The first time she ran to him and called him Dad, Sam cried like he'd never cried before. Silently, hidden behind a dirty handkerchief and a sunset that seemed warmer than ever. Eleanor, little by little, began to show up too. Sometimes she brought food. Other times, she just came to watch. She sat silently on the porch while Clara ran through the fields. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. Their presence was enough. One day, weeks later, a letter arrived in town, stamped with the postmark of San Rafael on the southern border. It was short, just a few lines, written in Thomas Ward's familiar handwriting. I hope you're all well. Don't expect to hear from me. Keep what's right. Let the desert take the rest. Sam read the letter and burned it without saying a word. And then, one bright Sunday morning, Eleanor appeared at the ranch door with Clara at her side. Shall we have lunch together? He asked. Sam smiled. This, for him, was more than an invitation. It was redemption. That day, the three of them sat at the table. Clara told stories about school. Eleanor watched Sam's movements with silent, almost reverent attention. And when he looked up at her, he saw something there he hadn't seen in years. Peace. The town, finally, breathed a different air. Dust Creek was still marked by the past, but now it was moving forward. With scars, yes, but also with a new chance. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about belonging. To reconquer, not what was lost, but what could still be. To write, with one's own hands, the chapter that destiny tried to tear. And Sam Ward, the man who came back too late, was now, finally, a living part of history that no one could erase. If you've made it this far, thank you for following this intense and moving journey. If this story touched you in any way, if it made your heart race, if it made you curious, or even if it brought a tear to your eye, leave your like that's it. Subscribe to the channel to continue following our narratives. Activate the bell not to be missed. The Old West holds many ghosts, and we're just beginning to unearth them. See you in the next chapter.